Well, boa tarde, good afternoon. Thanks for your words. It's a pleasure. Oops, I forgot something. Just a second. It's a big pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Professor Candace Slater for the invitation and Professor Harvey Shaken for the introduction and the warm welcome and the kindness, and everyone at the Portuguese and the Spanish and Portuguese Department and the Center of Latin American Studies. I will be reading today from a book called Crow Blue. It is not my latest novel, but it's my latest novel translated into English. It came out in the UK last fall, and it's coming out in the US in the summer. This book tells a story, just to give you a little bit of a setting. It's narrated by a 13-year-old Brazilian girl who loses her mother and comes to the United States to look for her biological father. And in this process, she will be helped by her mother's ex-husband from the time before she was born. And he happens to be a former guerrilla, communist guerrilla in the times of the Brazilian military dictatorship. And he fought in the Araguaia guerrilla, one of the most controversial and darkest episodes of the Brazilian recent history. So being in contact with Fernando, this man, Vanja, the girl, the character, not only she gets in contact with an unknown part of her personal history, but also the history of her own country from decades before she was born. So what I'm going to do is what I usually like doing is that I will read a brief paragraph in Portuguese just so people can hear a little bit of the original language in which the book was written, and then I'll switch to English. And then we'll have time to discussion and questions and that kind of thing. O Pará é um país inteiro. Tem tamanho de país. Dentro do Pará caberiam quase 2 Franças, 3 Japões, 2 Espanhas e uns trocados, mais de 1.600 Singapuras. Naquela imensidão ao norte do Brasil, que o próprio Brasil ignorava, viviam 2 milhões de pessoas quando Chico pôs ali os pés pela primeira vez. Chovia sobre a terra, enlameada e escorregadia, onde os sapatos se enterravam e ficavam grudados. Depois ele levantava a perna e na sola vinha um grumo de lama sobressalente. Chovia sobre o rio, o Araguaia, o rio das Araras. Okay. Pará was a whole country. It was the size of a country. Pará was almost big enough for 2 Frances, 3 Japans, 2 Spains and a bit. More than 1,600 Singapores. In that vastness in Brazil's north, to which Brazil itself was oblivious, lived 2 million people when Chico set foot there for the first time. Chico is the character's code name. His name is Fernando. Chico is the code name that he used. It rained on the land, which was muddy and slippery, where shoes sank in and became stuck, and came up sporting extra clods of mud on their soles when he lifted his feet. It rained on the river, the Araguaia, the river of the Macaus. It rained on the forest, the wild, superhuman Amazon, which the communists believed would be a friend of the rebels, hell for the armed forces, an area fertile for planting subversion, as an army report would conclude. The rain made Chico's clothes stick to his body, his hair to his forehead. He glanced to one side, and even though it wasn't 100% appropriate at the time, he decided to have a chuckle at the water dripping from the straight black hair of the young woman the guerrillas had come to collect in Xambioá along with him, to take to that piece of nowhere where they were now arriving, strangers to one another, strangers to everyone else, strangers to the place, strangers, period. He decided to laugh at the forest's thick rain drooping from her eyelashes, which made her blink a lot. And she ended up laughing too, even if it wasn't 100% appropriate at the time. She laughed at the dirty, worn t-shirt stuck to the thin kid's chest, and laughed because she didn't know anything, where she was, what exactly she was going to do there under the generic name of guerrilla training, where that thin kid was from. His hands were calloused, his arms were firm. Her hands were the elegant hands of a student from Rio, much more accustomed to books than to the jungle. She had smuggled some nail polish and nail polish remover with her in her bag, and a wad of cotton. The young woman would discover that Chico knew how to use a hoe, that he was good with weapons, and other things. When the enemy advances, withdraw. When he stops, harass. When he tires, strike. When he retreats, pursue. The young woman went by the code name Manuela. She had left Rio de Janeiro not knowing her final destination. When she arrived in the forest, she was given a large knife and a revolver. She would live in a crude shack together with a group that included the thin kid. It was the Favela guerrilla base, Detachment A. She would learn to sleep in a hammock, use a revolver, and work the land. Her elegant hands would cease to be elegant. The nail polish and nail polish remover would never be used. She would help set up a small school in a nearby village and would start to teach there. She would grow fond, and then very fond, of the thin kid, who wasn't a kid, as he was 25, 2 years older than her. Fine, but he looked like a kid. One day he told her about Peking, the frozen mud, the children playing in the snow, the opera, the farms and factories that he had visited. Fine, but he still looked like a kid. Deep in the forest, their neighbors were squatters, people who had fled the drought in Brazil's northeast, which lacked the wealth that fell here in abundance, the rainwater that muddied the ground, that stuck to the soles of Chico's worn shoes, and that ran from Manuela's damaged, glamourless hair, falling as only Amazonian rain knows how to fall. The squatters would arrive and occupy a piece of land in the middle of that no man's land. They would fell some trees, build a hut to live in, and stay on. A little over a year from then, General Médici affixed a bronze plaque to a tree trunk in the municipality of Altamira, inaugurating the great highway, which will go down in history as the most monumental public work conceivable by the military regime. The plaque said, "On these banks of the Xingu, deep in the Amazon jungle, the President of the Republic begins the construction of the Trans-Amazonian Highway, a historic start to the conquest of this gigantic green world." In Altamira, the tree trunk with the plaque commemorating the inauguration of the Trans-Amazonian Highway is known as the President's Tree, o pau do presidente. There is some vegetation growing over it. Nearby is the municipality of Medicilândia, but most of the population doesn't know who Médici was. To me, he was yet another name in a history book, on a list of past presidents that we had to memorize. Someone who had called the shots in Brazil when my mother was still a child, when I wasn't even an idea, or a wish, or a danger, when I wasn't even holding a number, waiting for someone to say, "Off you go, it's your life now, it starts in 5 minutes." It was as if Fernando and I were from different countries. In 40 years, an unimaginable number of things can happen. A fraction of them actually do. People are born, die, several disappear from the map without a trace. Trans-Amazonian highways, inaugurated with great pomp, are never finished, and the size of the wound can even be seen from outer space. Jeep drivers and motorcyclists often travel it in pursuit of mud and excitement. Eclipses take place, tidal waves, earthquakes and hurricanes stir up many parts of the planet. Amazon forests start being cleared. Non-governmental organizations emerge in their defense. Amazon forests continue being cleared to the order of 1 Belgium a year, basically for cattle farming, the miracle of the transubstantiation of forest into beef. In 40 years, girls called Evangelina appear in the world. They grow up in front of the sea in Copacabana. They suspect almost nothing. They have never seen eclipses. They have never witnessed tidal waves or earthquakes or hurricanes. Nor do they dream of moist Amazon forests where communist guerrillas once ventured, got wet, got dirty, fell in love, fired guns, got shot, were taken prisoner, hauled off to torture sessions, and then buried here and there after they were dead. And one fine day, deep in the innocence of youth, one of those blue Rio de Janeiro days, far from Altamira and São João do Araguaia, one of those days when the city wakes up and looks in the mirror and decides, okay, today I'm going to be postcard perfect. On a day like this, the mother of one such Evangelina goes to her daughter calmly and seriously and tells her something. It starts like this. Vanja, let's go out for an ice cream. Vanja leaps up from the front of the television. She pushes the button to turn off the set, which is already quite old and has a purplish smudge in the upper left-hand corner. It is as if it were growing ill, the poor TV. One day the purplish smudge is going to spread across the entire screen, and the televised world will be uniformly purple. Susanna, her mother, doesn't say much. They go out for an ice cream. Vanja wants one of the new flavor, that caramelized milk one coated in chocolate and almonds. It is one of the most expensive, but Susanna says, okay. Strange. Vanja is suspicious. The two of them walk down to the beach promenade. They pass the beggar who lives on the corner of Rua do Vivier with his dog. The dog wags its tail. There's something I need to tell you, says Susanna, when they sit on a bench facing the beach, the afternoon stretching their elastic shadows towards the sea. The sea has a magnet that attracts things and people and their shadows. Sometimes it regurgitates remains, sometimes it doesn't. Vanja is 11, Susanna 30 years older. The important thing that she needs to tell her daughter is the only entirely predictable one, except that it is going to happen a little before its time. She explains, talks, then listens. She answers all questions. The questions are never-ending until they end, and with them the postcard-perfect afternoon and the need for answers. Everything is going to be the same as before, Susanna says after a time. Vanja wants to dive down to the ocean floor where strangely colored mollusks live strange lives. That night, Vanja and her mother don't say good night. Can I sleep in your bed? Asks Vanja. Susanna says yes. Vanja thinks her mother is beautiful, even if she has wrinkles around her eyes and the skin under her chin is beginning to get a little loose. She hugs her mother with all those wrinkles, with folds of fat in undesirable places, when they lie down to sleep. Everything is going to be the same as before. Nothing is going to be the same as before, and they know it. My mother explained everything to me that day, with our shadows stretching out in front of us on the Copacabana beach promenade towards the sea, at the entrance to the bay. Behind the headlands is a bay that appears to have been painted by the supreme painter-architect of the world, God our Lord, said Father Fernão Cardim, the Portuguese Jesuit priest 5 centuries earlier. My mother spoke calmly, carefully, and seriously, and I put away the information like an item of clothing that you only use from time to time, a scarf, for example, in Rio de Janeiro, but which you know is there, at the back of the wardrobe, waiting for you. She knew I needed the information. And that's the way it was until the following year. I turned 12, my breasts suddenly sprang out under my blouse like employees late for work. My mother died, as she said she would, and it didn't take long, as she had told me it wouldn't. And afterwards, nothing was the same as before, as we both knew it wouldn't be. I went to live with Elisa, my mother's foster sister, and she got it. She was the only one. Elisa let me lose as much weight as I wanted, sleep as much as I wanted, and have as much insomnia as I wanted. Elisa let me not talk as much as I wanted, and she let me celebrate my 13th birthday with our octogenarian neighbors, and then take a piece of cake to the beggar and his dog on the corner of Rua do Vivier. I squatted down next to the beggar and his dog, and I noticed that the beggar had brown eyes and the dog had green eyes, and in the eyes of both were things I had never read about in encyclopedias. Elisa helped me when, at a given moment, I said, "I want to call Fernando." "What Fernando?" she asked, forgetting who he was, and thus unaware of the importance that he had come to have in my life. "Fernando, my mother's ex-husband," I said. Officially, Fernando was my father and legal guardian. When my mother fell pregnant to my real father, an American, she disappeared from his life, and when I was born in New Mexico, she found her ex-husband Fernando, who lived in the north, to the north in the state of Colorado, 6 hours away by car. He drove down and registered me the next day as his daughter in Albuquerque. He told my mother to take care of herself. Then he drove back. They had been divorced for 4 years, and he possibly knew her well enough that she didn't have to explain anything, that she didn't want any ties to her daughter's real father, that she didn't want her daughter to grow up without a father's name on her birth certificate, that she didn't dare ask anyone else, that life sometimes was a bit complicated. I have no idea what happened between the two of them after that. All the information I have is that later, that same year, 1988, Fernando went to Albuquerque to spend Christmas with me and my mother. He stayed in the adobe house, which only had 2 rooms, mine and my mother's. Maybe he slept on the living room couch. The highways are an adventure in December in this part of the world. Fernando was on the road for much more than the usual 6 hours between cities on Interstate 25. There was snow and ice on the road. He passed a sign saying, "Welcome to New Mexico, land of enchantment," and in his rear view mirror saw a sign saying, "Welcome to colorful Colorado," with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the west. I don't know if when he arrived in Albuquerque, I was in my room dreaming pint-sized dreams, dreams that were the size of my life, that fit easily through the bars of the crib. I don't know if he and my mother embraced with the force of how deeply they missed one another, or thought they missed one another, or needed to miss one another because missing often keeps you company. I don't know if he went to bed with her, or if she just made some soup or tea, and they sat in front of the Christmas tree to sip the soup or tea, and then she helped him spread some sheets and a blanket over the living room couch. The following year, he didn't go to Albuquerque at Christmas. And 2 years later, my mother and I returned to Brazil. It was supposed to be for good. In her case, it was. A curious phenomenon happens when you have been away from home for too long. Your idea of what home is, a city, a country, slowly fades like a colorful image exposed to the sun on a daily basis. But you don't quickly acquire another image to put in its place. Try. Act like, dress like, speak like the people around you, use the slang, go to the in places, make an effort to understand the political spaces. Do it all. Act like. I met Brazilian immigrants who tried to forget they were Brazilian. They got themselves American partners, American children, American jobs, and stored the Portuguese language in some hard-to-access place in their throats, and only took pride in their origins when someone spoke praisingly of samba or capoeira, the later two in its origin, the martial art of the displaced, of the expatriated, of those torn from their homes. In the beginning, I thought it was a survival strategy. Maybe it was, or maybe it was just permeability. After a while, it is hard to remain unaffected, to keep dreaming in Portuguese when the other 16 hours of the day you are surrounded by American co-workers, American sales assistants, the Mexican postman who talks to you in English, American radio stations, American TV. Cordiality, necessity, shame, curiosity, ambition, admiration, the desire to be equal, to belong, whatever. After you have been away from home for too long, you become an intersection between two groups, like in those drawings we do at school. You belong to both, but you don't exactly belong to either. Your memory of home is always old, always out of date. It is as if people were telling each other secrets and you were always being surprised by old news. The people from Group A consider you somewhat different because you also belong to Group B. The people in Group B eye you a little suspiciously because you also belong to Group A. You are something hybrid and impure. And the intersection of the groups isn't a place, it's just an intersection where two entirely different things give people the impression that they converge. For example, I'd go buy a sandwich and would place my order as carefully as possible, remembering my mother's perfect English, arranging each vowel and consonant in my mouth with feng shui attention to detail. A few instants later, the girl at the cash register would ask me where I was from. Damn, how is it that other people can hear an accent if you can't? Later, I realized that life away from home is a possible life, one of many possible lives. Fernando had been to so many places after leaving home that he could no longer remember the way back. Of course, home wasn't there anymore, therefore the way back couldn't be either. And it wasn't that home was everywhere. No, that's for citizens of the world, for those who travel for sport, for those who have never commando crawled through the frozen mud in China and never run the risk of being devoured by bears in Alaska. It wasn't that home was everywhere. Home wasn't anywhere. How did you end up here? I heard myself asking as Fernando was fixing the toilet. I had been putting off the question for a month, 4 weeks, during which he made phone calls when he got back from work, looked up people he used to know whom he didn't know anymore, asked questions, moonlighted as a detective. He had hunches, suspected, supposed. And he didn't uncover anything worthy of note, not a smidgen of a clue, no bread trail in the forest. Why do people have to cover up their former lives so well? I had 1,200 pages of questions about my mother, about him and my mother, about my father and my mother, about New Mexico, about the scenes acted out before I was born. I wanted to know why people chopped and changed between lives like that, and changed cities and changed countries, and took out new citizenships or didn't take out new citizenships. Why, in this chopping and changing, old loves dropped off the face of the earth, and old loves transubstantiated into friendships dropped off the face of the earth, and why fathers dropped off the face of the earth. But the question popped out as Fernando was fixing the toilet and I was looking on, sitting on the edge of the bathtub. I was there to offer help, as a scrub tech perhaps, but he didn't seem to need my help, so instead I offered him a question. That question, how did you end up here? I thought maybe he didn't want to talk about it. Fernando didn't seem like the kind of person who kept the past in colorful photo albums to show visitors. He didn't look at me. Your mother didn't tell you. My mother didn't tell me much about you. She didn't talk much about the things that happened in her life before me. A few moments of silence. I met your mother in London. I was working in a bar, and one day she came in with her American boyfriend. They were on vacation. At some point, she came up to the bar to get 2 more beers, and she said, "You're not from here, your accent is different." And I decided I was going to steal her from her American boyfriend, before I even knew that besides being American like him, she was also Brazilian like me. "And did you steal her?" He looked at me. "Don't flush it for an hour until it's dry." "Okay." Fernando left the bathroom and I followed him. He opened the fridge and took out a beer. "Those were hard times in London," he said. "I wasn't there sightseeing. I was there because I couldn't stay in Brazil. That was way before you were born. You're lucky. Those were hard times." He took a swig of beer. I opened the cupboard and got out the packet of extra cheesy cheese crackers that were covered in a kind of dust that left my fingers dirty. "Want some?" He took a handful and dirtied his fingers with the extra cheesy cheese cracker dust. "Of course I stole your mother from her American boyfriend. I went to great lengths. For him, things were guaranteed. She was his girlfriend, not mine, so I had to fight for her. And that's why I followed Susanna here to the United States." It was the first time in a month that he had said my mother's name. "Later," he went on, "you know how life is." No, I didn't know. "You wake up one day and you're 50 years old and you've lost that urge to do things, to wander around, to look for a place in the world, because the truth is that the world is a pretty fucking wild place. It's not worth it. It doesn't make any difference." He took another swig of beer. The doorbell rang. Fernando went to open it, responded in monosyllables for 2 minutes to something a woman was telling him. He came back with the pamphlet, which he tossed on the table, and I read out of the corner of my eye. "Does God really care about us? Will there ever be an end to war and suffering? What happens to us when we die? Is there any hope for the dead? How can I pray and be heard by God? How can I find happiness in this life?" Fernando cleared his throat. "Sorry I said fucking. I've been meaning to tell you. I've been making some phone calls and I've managed to find an old friend of your mother's who lives in Santa Fe. She might be able to help us track down Danielle." It was the first time in a month that he had said my father's name. Through the open window, I heard the woman with the God pamphlets talking to our neighbor, who had hair the color of fire and who was answering very loudly in her Hispanic English. Thank you. Thanks. I hope my reading, my accent was not too bad.
Are there any questions?
Yes, Candace?
Is it a different experience maybe to read in English as compared to reading in Portuguese? Certainly the translation is excellent, but do you actually feel different about the words feel different as they come out?
They do. It's someone once mentioned that even my gestual changes, that my expression changes, and I think I have a different relationship with both languages. And of course, it's much more difficult for me to read in English, so I have to pay extra attention, and maybe it doesn't come out that naturally. On the other hand, I enjoy it. It's a nice experience for me. I like when I'm able to read my works in translation. It's like I don't know. It's like reading my voice through someone else's voice, and it's quite an interesting experience, I think.
Does the personage seem any different? Does Vanja seem different in English?
Not that much. Not that much, because I think she is part of the two cultures, the Portuguese language culture and the English language culture. So I don't really, in her case, in the case of the character, I don't see that much of a difference.
Well, with others, yes.
With others, perhaps, yeah. Other books that don't have any direct relationship with this country and this language, so it's really more schizophrenic, and in this case, there is a connection. So. Yeah.
I don't know how to make a question out of this, but I'm very fascinated by a certain obsession with space in your novel. There's a beautiful sentence in a part where the rose is in Colorado that says something like, "It was the dictatorship of space." And then you start the fragment that you just read. You started with the Amazon and the experience of space and the immensity of the space, right? And then you talk about home, and I mean, I think you have so many images of space that I'm just fascinated by it, and I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about it.
Well, I think it is basically a book about space in many senses, like the search for the space one occupies in life, in the in another sense, it had to do with a strong impression that I moved to Colorado 7 years ago, and I would travel. I was a visiting scholar in the University of New Mexico, so I would do this travel back and forth by car many, many times, and I was so impressed with how huge that nature was. And then I would mention this to people, and they would say, "But wait a minute, you're from Brazil, so you're not supposed to be that impressed." So I started to notice the different scales and the different kinds of immensity that are present in my life. So in Rio, you have the mountains, of course, but they are not as big as the Rocky Mountains. But you have the sea, and then in Colorado, I had, as you were mentioning from the book, that sense of the dictatorship of the space. You have the plains to one side, the Rockies to the other side, and the sky, and it feels like everything human becomes so unimportant and so fragile in that perspective. So that was an idea that interested me to explore, this idea of our human relationship to those immense spaces that we cannot occupy, either physical spaces or emotional spaces and what have you. I think this is more or less what I had in mind. There's also, of course, the gigantic poetic potential, of course, of those things.
Do you feel like seeing your work in English and also as your own English as you become more familiar with it, has that changed the way you write in Portuguese?
Yeah, definitely. Even though I still write in Portuguese, of course, and I think I always will, but there is a peculiarity in English and in my relationship with English, because English is such a direct language, and in Portuguese we take our time to say things. We are very baroque, and we like, and English is so precise. You have a verb for everything, you have a word for everything. So I think I began to think in more precise terms. So whenever I write in Portuguese, I'm looking for a more precise way of expressing things, of saying things. So I think that, and of course, there's also an aesthetic preoccupation or I don't know, path that I'm really looking for things more simple. If I compare my first novel to my latest novel, the latest is much more simple and to the point. And this is something that I personally want to achieve. It's something that I pursue. And I think the relationship with the English language, it helps a lot. And it has an influence, and it also helps in a way.
I was just thinking of your recent novels, One After As a Glove.
Mm-hmm.
You're dealing now with, again, situated in the United States, but with immigrants not only from Brazil but also from Vietnam. So my interest, you have in your previous book, Fallen Persimmons, has this interest in Japan. So you're always, your interest in Brazil and the United States seems very much grounded in your own personal experience. But how do you relate to the language or to sort of this fascination with Japan, with Vietnam, with these other spaces are also very distinct in different languages. How is that, and how have you incorporated that into your work?
The relationship with Japan and Vietnam were very different. In the case of Hut of Fallen Persimmons, I was completely madly in love with the poetry of Japanese poet Matsuo Basho. So I decided to write a novel that was partly inspired by one of his travel diaries. So the characters travel to Japan. So there is the theme of the travel itself. People from Brazil who go to Japan who don't speak the language. One of the guys is of Japanese descent but doesn't know anything, doesn't speak the language, couldn't care less. So there is this rediscovery and the idea of traveling. As the poet Basho himself liked to travel a lot, and he wrote a lot about traveling, so that's in that book. In the case of Azul Corvo, it's more the immigrant experience, legal, illegal, and this going to really live in a different place, and how you come to terms with that in your own mind and heart. And in the case of Hanoi, it was for me a step further, because many of the characters are refugees. So that's an even more radical experience than the experience of the immigrant. I worked with refugees in Denver for a year, and I got in contact with many people who live unbelievable things, and people who don't relocate because they want to. They're not travelers who want to be someplace else and go, or immigrants who have sometimes a lot of difficulty, but in a way want to go to another place. They are thrown in another country because their country is at war. There's religious or persecution, for instance. And you meet with people that, for instance, had never seen electricity or a fridge or a toilet, and things that we take completely for granted it's mind-blowing. And that experience really made me think the whole relocation and the physical displacement thing with yet another level of another perspective. So I wanted to create, not the main character is not a refugee, but he meets this girl who is of Vietnamese descent. And I was also, when I started doing research for this book, I learned something that is probably something that every American knows, but for me it was a discovery. The children in Vietnam who were born of Vietnamese mothers and American soldiers, who were they had after the war they had no place at all in Vietnam because they were children of the enemy, but they couldn't come to America, so they had no place in Vietnam. And afterwards in the 80s, they were received officially by the American government. They could come, but they didn't speak the language. They couldn't do any kind of work, so they ended up in places like New York, completely out of place. So these were people that were really out of place anywhere in the world, people who didn't have a place at all. And that was something quite radical and quite moving to research and to try to understand. And I went to Vietnam to try and find a little bit of traces, sort of a heritage, of this. And it was quite interesting what I found, because people still want to leave Vietnam and come to America. So there's a kind of an official market of Vietnamese people who come to America, and then they work to try and arrange marriages with other Vietnamese so they can come. And so there is this idea that the biggest goal, the most wonderful thing that can happen is to really go to America and leave Vietnam. But this is not the main subject of the book. It's just a...
But it's interesting that this sense of displacement appears in all of these works yet in different variations and different. So it seems almost that your books are speaking much more, especially as you continue your first novels and more recent, moving away from Brazilian and more to global experiences of dislocation, or got more radical sense of relocation. So I really wonder if your personal experiences influence that, or also mentions the process of research. What research entails or informs your work before you write?
I would say that definitely my personal experience has an influence. I don't like the idea of writing about myself, though. So it's not how we call in Portuguese now. There's a name for this. Autoficção. Autoficção. Yeah, that's something that doesn't interest me at all, because I think that the good thing, the most interesting thing about writing fiction is that you get to be someone else, that you get to wear someone else's skin. So it wouldn't be that interesting for me to write about myself. On the other hand, I am deeply influenced by what I see and what I experience and what I see other people around me experiencing. So in a way, it is my own world, but it involves a look to what's not me. And in that sense, there is sometimes a good degree of research involved, especially in the cases, of course, of subjects that I haven't experienced myself, such as the case as the Vietnamese refugees, or the passages of the guerrilla do Araguaia in Crow Blue. So that's the kind of research I do.
Are there other questions?
Yes. In terms of, you hold a doctorate from where? I was just curious in terms of your studies of literature. In what ways have they affected or not affected or caused some sort of rift or whatever? In what ways do they hold together or not hold together, or complement each other, or collide?
I would say that they tend to collide more than anything. So what happened was that I have an undergrad degree in music, and I worked with music for many years.
The voice, right?
I'm sorry?
The voice.
Yeah.
In terms of music, you were interested
in singing, but I have my degree is actually in flute, so I played the flute for years. But I was always writing, and I actually wanted to write more. So when I was writing my first novel, I decided to go back to school and do my master's and my PhD in literature. But that was for me a way to, I don't know, to have a place where I would be able to discuss literature with people who were also, thinking about literature, because I really didn't know anyone. I didn't know any authors nor anyone involved with literature. So that was my... And then the first book that I wrote when I was doing my master's, it's called Beijo de Colombina, and it's a book that has a relationship with the poetry of Manuel Bandeira. It was a struggle for me not, for that book not to be contaminated by a more academic kind of thinking. It was then that I realized that it was dangerous. You had to, in a way, you had to choose, because it's very, very difficult, and I think very few people can do that well, to really be wonderful in fiction and in academic and essays and critic, and it's tough to balance all these, in my opinion. So I really, after my PhD, I've had enough. It's fine. I mean, I love the academic world, but I don't write essays. I'm not a critic. I don't even write. I used to, but I don't anymore write reviews nor anything, because I think it's too close to a kind of thinking that can interfere in a negative way with. But that's me. I mean, it's not a. How do you call? I forgot the expression, but it's not some value that I
So did you experience as a translator? How did that intersect stuck with your work as a writer, or did you feel a similar type of contamination as you did from, or collision between experiences of translating and a writer?
I think mostly translating makes you a good reader, because you have to read attentively, and you have to look for precise words, and sometimes you have choices, and you have to look for the one that fits that place better, and you have to avoid certain tricks like internal rhymes and that kind of. You have to be extra careful with the text, and I think this is a hell of a school for writing. I think it really, really, really helps. For me, it helped a lot because it really made me much more conscious of the text in a minute level, in a very specific level. And so it helped. There's the downside, because of course it's tiresome. So when you translate a book, you're in someone else's head, and it's difficult to leave that head and go back to your own head. So, and it's physically tiresome, and I had many episodes of repetitive strain injury because I was just typing all day long. So even though I enjoy translating, I just decided to stop doing it.
What is your relationship with your translators? If you learned English or into other languages, did you work closely with the translator?
When they contact me, yeah, sometimes they don't, which, I'm suspicious because I'm here, I'm not dead, so they can go ahead and contact me. And even when I don't speak the language, for instance, my translator into German, he sent me, 50 questions about the book. He found problems in the book that no one else had found before him, and the book had been translated, into various other languages. So it's a wonderful possibility of relationship when it happens. With Alison Entrekin, the translator of Crow Blue, we've never met, but we are great friends because we've exchanged so many emails, and about doubts that she had, things that she wanted to ask me, and feedback that I had for her after I was able to read the translation. And now she's translating my poems. She wants to. I'm publishing my first book of poetry in Brazil this year, and she has already translated a few of the poems, and she wants to translate the whole book. So it's yet another experience, because then she's not. When you translate poetry, I've done it once. I translated a book of poetry by Margaret Atwood, and it's a step further. I don't know. You are a little bit more of an author too. So I noticed this when we discuss her translations of my poems, because sometimes she has to come up with solutions that I can't interfere. It's up to you, whatever you want. So it's a wonderful relationship when it happens.